Yeah, good morning, everyone. Coming to the today case presentation from the Department of Medical Oncology. So this is regarding a 64-year-old female who is a resident of Pune, who is housewife by occupation. She is presented with the chief complaints of cough with since 6 months, and no other complaints are there. History of present illness, sir. Complaints of cough since 6 months, which is dry, not associated with any expectoration or bleeding. It is associated with chest pain, no diurnal or postnal variation. No complaints of breathlessness, no complaints of fever, but there is a complaints of loss of weight of 5 kgs over the last 2 months. The complaints of loss of appetite was there. No complaints of hoarseness of voice or difficulty in swallowing. No history of ptosis or thinning of the hands. No history of easy fatigability. No history of swelling of face or edema. No complaints of any swelling over the neck. No complaints of any bony pains. No complaints of headache, seizures, or altered behavior. And no complaints of any bladder or bowel disturbances. Coming to the past history, there are no history of similar complaints in the past, but patient had an history of rheumatoid arthritis diagnosed at 6 years back, for which initially patient has been taking steroids, and then patient has been gradually shifted to methotrexate plus sulfasalazine, initially 1000 mg, and now the patient at present she is taking 500 mg OD. And there is no history of diabetes or hypertension or pulmonary tuberculosis or any history of chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, and there is no history of any surgeries or trauma in the past. The personal history, she is a non-vegetarian by dietary habits. She used to have an adequate sleep. She is a non-smoker, non-alcoholic, and there is no any occupational exposure. Family history, patient husband had an history of pulmonary tuberculosis diagnosed 1 year back, for which he had taken ATT for almost 6 months. So history of contact to the pulmonary tuberculosis is there. And coming to the treatment history, as I mentioned earlier, she had known case of rheumatoid arthritis, for which she's initially started on steroids and then polytrexate injection along with the sulfasalazine. At present, she is on sulfasalazine 500 mg OD. And for the above complaints, for the cough, patient has been evaluated outside at the local physician, and for which she has been advised to do one chest X-ray. And chest X-ray was shown some query mass lesion in the left lung, which made her to come to our hospital. Coming to the summary, 64-year-old female, no rheumatoid history of rheumatoid arthritis, no other comorbidities, non-smoker, with complaints of cough with chest pain for the past 6 months. So with this summary, the differential diagnosis in the background will be first thing will be the infective like tuberculosis, and second one will be the malignancy. These two are the probable differential diagnosis based on the history.
Why are you not keeping a differential diagnosis of lung fibrosis or something? Patient has rheumatoid arthritis. That would be a
granulomatous disorders also.
Granulomatous disorders autoimmune disorders of the lung would be a possibility in this case.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So if I was in your position, I would have first placed in a known case of rheumatoid arthritis who's coming with his complaint, non-smoker, looking for whether there are autoimmune changes which have happened in the lung. The second would be tuberculosis, because patient is already taking sulfasalazine, methotrexate, so is likely to be immunocompromised. And the third I would have kept would be as a cancer. So that would be that for this specific case. Okay.
Yes. Yes. So coming down on examination, she is conscious, coherent, cooperative, averagely built and nourished, well-oriented in time and place, comfortable at rest. There is no usage of any accessory muscles of respiration, no pallor, cyanosis, icterus or clubbing. There is no palpable lymphadenopathy or no pedal edema. Height 160 centimeters, weight 65, and BMI of 25.4. Vitals are also stable. And on inspection, there is no gross abnormality has been noted. Upper airways, no abnormality. Tracheal position is central. Apex beat is not visible. Movement of the chest is symmetrical on both sides, and there are no dilated veins, scars, or sinus, or visible pulsations over the skin. And coming to the palpation, there is no tenderness. Tracheal position is central. There is no crowding of ribs. Movement of chest was slightly decreased over the upper and anterior portion of the left side. And coming to the tactile firmness, it is increased slightly in the left infraclavicular region. And on measurements, on the left hemithorax is slightly on the lower side, 39 centimeters on inspiration and 37 centimeters on expiration. As on the right hemithorax, it is slightly higher, 41 centimeters on inspiration and 39 centimeters on expiration. So percussion, there is a resonant on all over the lung except in all areas except for the left infraclavicular area, and there is a liver dullness is there. And decreased breath sounds has been noted in the left infraclavicular area on auscultation, and normal vesicular breath sounds are present in all other areas. So other system examination like breast, CVS, and perabdominal CNS was normal. So the differential diagnosis will be the same. because the patient had given a history of outside visit to the local physician, and chest X-ray was showing some mass lesion, very mass lesion in the lung. So first, I would like to keep the differential diagnosis of primary malignant lung lesion, and second will be metastasis, and third one because the patient had a history of contact with the tuberculosis and underlying history of rheumatoid arthritis. So the pulmonary tuberculosis will be the third, and last any granulomatous disorders will be the fourth differential diagnosis.
Yeah, Ravi, that is good. Well, so today is not a case presentation, so I won't go in that details. But see, you will be presenting case at your DM level in the exam, so there is no harm in telling that the patient had visited a physician
Yes, sir.
outside. He has done a chest X-ray, he has done a CT scan, and
Yes,
which is
sir.
all he has been already told that there is lung mass. There's
Yes,
no
sir.
need to hide these things. So just inform that the things can move smoothly.
Yes,
Second
sir.
thing is, if this is a case in exam, what you would be expected is to give a structural diagnosis. So for respiratory case, you need to give structural diagnosis, whether there is a whether
Yeah.
you feel there is fibrosis, pleural effusion. So structural diagnosis, what harm has been happened to the lung and which side, and according to that structural diagnosis, then you will be asked for etiological diagnosis. So when you present a lung case in exam, lung means a respi case in exam, just know that you would be expected to give structural diagnosis that patient has pleural effusion, pneumothorax, or a consolidation. Yeah, and along with the structural diagnosis, what are the probable cause for that structural anomaly? That's the way you would be expected to answer in exam. We won't go diverge in that because today the class is for discussing the management in a multi-disciplinary. So you go ahead and tell us about the investigations what were done for this patient.
Yes.
Vijay sir, one thing
Yeah,
I
yeah.
would Virendra here, sir. So
Yeah.
Ravi, you said that left side measurements are less than the right side, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So why do you think that has happened?
So I thought because there is some maybe because of the collapse, consolidation, or fibrosis of the lung on the left side, because there is a decreased breath sounds out there on the left infraclavicular region, and there is an measurements are also on the left side. It is less. I thought probably because of the fibrosis or collapse consolidation.
Yeah, correct. So again, this hints towards a long-standing cause rather than a very acute stuff. So what Vijay sir was saying in differential, maybe your other stuff can come higher than the lung mass. Obviously, patient gave history of lung mass. That's why differential will have malignancy also. But
Yes,
if you don't know that patient had a malignancy, then things will come higher maybe because of these structural changes. I think.
yes, sir. Okay. Sir. So the patient underwent CT scan, and then the CT just showing the lung window. CT scan was showing left upper lobe mass, which is primarily in the left parahilar region, and it is just encasing that, compressing that left main bronchus, and it is very close to the pulmonary artery. Then coming to the mediastinal window. So in this one also, we can see there are only subcarinal. In the subcarinal region, there is one small node has been noted. Apart from that, no other nodes are there. Here on this, in this region, you can note one lymph node in the subcarinal. It is approximately around 1 to 1.5 centimeter. So this is the investigation done.
Ravi, really sorry. So one more thing. So when you comment on a CT scan, on lung window, comment about the mass. And when
Yes.
you go to mediastinal window, that time you comment about pulmonary vessels. So artery, you comment on this window, not on that one.
Yes, sir. Yes.
That's important, Ravi.
Yes, sir.
You don't comment about mediastinal structures in a lung window.
Lung. From the patient, after that patient has been attached to do one PET CT, she underwent it outside. It has been reviewed here, so we don't have the images, but I have mentioned that 3 into 3 into 2 centimeter parahilar mass compressing the left main bronchus at the level of bifurcation. Along with that, multiple mediastinal lymph nodes are there: peritracheal, lower paratracheal, para-aortic, and paraesophageal, and right hilar. And largest one was 1.5 to 1.3 centimeter in the subcarinal region. So the biopsy has been done, CT-guided biopsy has been done from the lung, and it came out as adenocarcinoma of primary pulmonary origin. And then EBUS has been done for this patient, and out of which 11 are 4 are and 7 has been sampled, and all came out as reactive. So this is the basic investigation workup, and along with this, the routine CBC and biochemical investigations has been done, which are in the normal range, and the PFT has also been done for this patient. So this FEV1 and FVC is more than 70%, and FE1 was 82% with LCO of 56.1%. So basically, to summarize this case, 64-year-old female non-smoker with a history of rheumatoid arthritis, good performance status of 1. CA left lung T2 lesion because of the involvement of main bronchus and based on size wise greater than 3 centimeters. And N2 lesion based on the PET findings, but EBUS came out as negative. But based on the PET findings, the N2 patient has been diagnosed as N2, and no other sites of metastasis out there, M0. So how to proceed in this case? The next step will be first I would like to do, because the EBUS came out as negative and PET was showing multiple lymph nodes. So the first step will be to, we should do the mediastinoscopy to confirm the mediastinal lymph nodes, whether they are positive or not. Then followed by the mediastinoscopy, if nodes comes out as positive, then we should go ahead with the definitive CT-RT, chemo-RT followed by maintenance therapy.
Ravi,
Yeah.
hi. So, thing is that if you're planning for chemo radiation, so we don't confirm with mediastinoscopy. Ideally, yes. But in our center, in our hospital, if EBUS is negative, we go ahead if patient is planned for CTI. Suppose patient is planned for a surgical management, then obviously we confirm with mediastinoscopy at the same sitting. And if nodes are negative, we proceed with lobectomy. But for
Yes.
CTRT, we don't usually do. But yes, the ideal recommendation says that to confirm medicinal node, if EBUS is negative, we proceed with mediastinoscopy.
Yes, sir.
Ravi, what was the uptake of these mediastinal nodes on the PET? Was
15, sir. 15.1 is the SUV, sir, maximum SUV.
so? Will you take that into account considering the EBUS is negative?
Yes, the point was the sensitivity for the or the positive predictive values. Negative predictive value for the PET CT will be high, so 90%, but the positive predictive value will be less. That is, it is around 70 to 75%. So if it is negative on PET, then I would definitely take it as negative. But positive on PET, I want to confirm with the next investigation like EBUS or mediastinoscopy. But here in this case, EBUS also came out as negative. For EBUS, there is a negative predictive value of 90%. That is, the false negative rates will be at around 10 to 15%. But there are multiple lymph nodes on the PET CT, primary very close to the mediastinum. So with a SUV value of 15, so I would consider taking these lymph nodes as positives.
Ravi, actually, this patient was also rheumatoid arthritis. So, do you think this has any significance in relation to nodes?
Yeah, exactly. I was also going to come to that point itself. So would you consider that the patient has a history of rheumatoid arthritis when you're looking at the PET scan?
So next, I'd like to ask Rajiv sir, any comment on histology and this nodes histopathology which was done on EBUS? Whether there was suggestion of any connective tissue disorder?
Can you repeat your question?
This patient having rheumatoid arthritis on EBUS, the nodes were negative for malignancy. So, is it likely that on histopathology we can comment these nodes may be related to some connective tissue disorder?
Yeah, so there are some features, but it is difficult to predict on the EBUS FNA material. So on FNA, especially in this case, this was showing on lymphoid-rich aspirate. There were no granuloma. So we try to look for any other coexisting findings, especially on the FNAC. And on biopsy, there can be some certain features, but those are very well described in the lung parenchyma, not on the in the lymph nodes. And based on that, like if there are lymphoid aggregates and there are some soft pointers, and if there are no associated granulomas or and no vasculitis, then we can raise the possibility of a connective tissue disorder. But there are no definite criteria on histology, and that those were also described mainly on the lung biopsies, not primarily. We can't make a diagnosis only on the FNA about the connective tissue disorders.
Okay. And
What
next,
would be your take on this? If the PET values are high and the EBUS come negative?
Yeah, so there are two things. There can be there can be a nodal involvement, maybe due to maybe not due to the tumor, but can be due to the other coexisting things. One thing is connective tissue disorder can also give, but there can be coexisting tuberculosis, which or granulomatous disease, which is more common or relevant in India. So, and the negative nodes might be due to the there can be sampling error because in the node. So that we can't exclude completely the sampling, and there might be some focal disease in the lung, focal either granulomas or something in the lung, but not picked up on the EBUS FNA.
Next question to Virendra sir. Sir, actually this patient was just labeled N2 based on the PET finding, but EBUS was negative. So she was technically T2 disease, and we planned this patient for CTRT. So what are the factors we look for planning surgery and referring to this for radiation therapy in this early lung cancer?
What I would like to say here that clinical staging includes your EBUS or mediastinal also. So if we have proven that those nodes are negative for disease, then I think that clinical stage will be N0 still. But planning for surgery accounts lot of other things like functional status and what are the pulmonary function tests mostly. So in this case, I think PFTs were not that great. Rest of the lung fields were also not looking good. And she has comorbidities. So that's why I think patient was planned for CTRT and not the surgical management. So PFT, which includes PFT and DLCO both. First thing, then cardiac evaluation with the 2D echo, then another simple exercise tolerance test, that is 6-minute walk test we do, where we see the length covered and the drop in saturation. So these things decide about choosing patient for surgery, and obviously what is the performance status, ECOG, and simple question that we ask like effort tolerance. So these all things we take into account and then plan for a surgery. If provided these functional outcomes like predicted post-operative value is more than 80, then obviously low risk. Less than 80, but 60 to 80, little bit of risk. Less than 60, more than 40, but 40 to 60 predicted post-operative value, moderate risk. Less than 40, obviously high risk. So we go for other functional tests like cardiopulmonary exercise testing investigations. So that is how we evaluate patient for a surgical planning.
Sir, one more question for you in chat box. What are the relative and borderline contraindication for surgery where you want to reassess after NACT?
Hey, what did you ask? Relative or?
What are relative borderline indication for surgery where you want to reassess after NACT?
So after NACT again, because so NACT takes around 3 or 2.5 months to complete, 3 cycle or 4 cycle. So during that time, there may be some deterioration of function or patient may improve also. We don't know. So again, after NACT, we do repeat pulmonary function test. Again, same thing, functional evaluation and pulmonary function tests are repeated. And we repeat a scan also to see response. So if patient has responded well, then obviously patient who can provide a functional evaluation for good patient to be planned for a surgery. But if there is a progression, or if you think that primary has responded, but there is no response to nodal disease, or there is a progression, then there is a scope of repeat response taking. So that is usually done with medicine. So again, pulmonary function test, functional evaluation, and restaging with a CT scan.
Lingaraj, what we do at here is if the pulmonary, the patient is resectable, but it is functionally is an issue that there are PFTs are borderline or the nutrition is borderline. And in that case, we have a series, Dr. Saurabh Zawar had published that, in that you give NACT, you build up the patient. And again, as Virendra pointed out, when the patient comes back after post-surgery, you again assess the factors, whether the patient has improved on those aspects. If the patient has improved on those aspects, then we can consider for surgery. If no, it would be depending on the response, it would go for CTRT or becoming palliative, that the way it would be done.
Yes, sir.
Next question to Anil sir. Sir, actually this patient is referred to RT because she was not fit for surgery because of her comorbidity, having interstitial lung disease due to RA, and PFT was also not great. So, sir, while planning for RT, what are the factors you decide? Means, is the what this level of PFT you expect to be fit for giving RT?
Yeah, so it's the same as that of for the surgery. As far as the physical fitness is concerned, the same thing is the performance to status, able to climb flight of stairs, how many flight of stairs that the patient can climb up with the 6-minute walk test. As far as the pulmonary functions are concerned, the PFT also dependent on the tumor location. For example, if there is a Pancoast tumor and you do not have a good pulmonary function also, then yeah, in that scenario, you can still go ahead with the definitive CTRT, because the radiation therapy is not going to affect too much of the lung, especially in Pancoast tumor. So it depends upon the tumor location in the lung, and obviously the size also. So radiotherapy for factors will be dependent on the primary location in the lung, right, left, upper lobe, middle lobe, lower lobe, how much mediastinal nodal involvement is there. Is it the station 7, 4R, 2R, or 4L, 2L is also involved. So it's just the length of the disease which will be very important in deciding the volumes of the radiation therapy. Yeah, in this particular scenario, as you can see, it was a left hilar mass, and there were mediastinal node, especially in the subaortic window, or 4L, I think. So it will not be going to be a very huge volume, and the DLC is 56%, and FEV1 was more or less close to 70%. So and the interstitial changes were there, but the patient was not classified as having interstitial lung disease. So the volume wise or the radiation therapy wise, it would not be a bad candidate for the CTRT, provided the patient does not have any frank evidence of any interstitial lung disease. If in case she does have the episode or the history of interstitial lung disease, so the scenario changes. Then we need to counsel the patient for the possible side effect of the flaring of the interstitial lung disease. But as of now, the patient does not have any history or indication of interstitial lung disease, so the patient is a good candidate for CTRT.
Sir, in addition to this PFT, suppose if it come borderline or patient having interstitial lung disease, any other test we are doing at TMH to see confirm pulmonary and cardiac reserve?
We generally don't do it here, because the majority of the time the pulmonary function tests are so bad that the patient is not eligible for CTRT, or the volume is too large. There are very few patients which we will not be able to decide whether he or she will be a candidate for CTRT. In that particular scenario, especially so with the fitness level is very easy to ascertain, as I've already mentioned. The only thing is that the volume constraint, the dose constraint to the lung as well as the heart, if they are not going to be achievable. So what we do at TMH is that we just take a planning CT scan and just draw our volume, and if the lung volumes are within a normal tolerable limit as given in the international guidelines and also our own guidelines, then we go ahead with the CTRT with the due risk of the radiation pneumonitis and esophagitis. But if the volumes are not going to be achieved, then in that scenario, we can refer the patient for the sequential chemoradiation therapy. What will happen with the sequential chemoradiation therapy? The volume of the pulmonary mass will reduce. So the mediastinal stent is not going to affect much. So because the node will be there and we will have to treat the residual nodal station, but the primary mass will be decreasing, and the patient rehabilitation, nutritional rehabilitation, pulmonary rehabilitation, the ability to climb flight of stairs might get increased. So in that scenario, we can offer the sequential chemoradiation therapy. One more thing, as far as the early stage lung cancer, majority of the patient, if they are medically inoperable, they do get ventilation perfusion scanning. So in that scenario, we can also ask for a ventilation perfusion scan just to see what functional areas of the lung are there and whether our primary lung mass is in the functional area or in the non-functional area. So that is one of the investigation that we might ask if it has not been done previously.
Sir, both are needed, a ventilation scan and perfusion scan, or only perfusion scan will be
Both.
enough?
So both will be advisable, because it is important that it's not only the ventilation that will be the factor, it is the diffusion, because if the radiation pneumonitis set in, the most important factor that goes down first is the diffusion, is the DLCO, a drop of 5 to 10% in the DLCO values.
Thank you, sir. And sir, next, now these patients refer for radiation and concurrent chemo. So, which means radiation modality technique you will be preferring, and what volume you will be covering?
See, there is no head-to-head any randomized evidence between CDCRT and IMRT, but as we all know, it is obvious from the secondary analysis of RTOG 0617 also that IMRT is very conformal. It helps in reducing the low doses of in the high doses of the lung, as well as also to the heart. So it is preferable in lung because it is surrounded by the lung itself, and lung itself is an organ at risk because we do not want to irradiate the normal lung. So IMRT is preferable if the facility is available. There is no overall survival benefit, but it does reduces the risk of radiation pneumonitis, and which is one of the very most important toxicities in lung cancer radiation therapy. So IMRT will be preferable if it is available at a particular center. Now, if it is not, a good 3D CRT plan will also do. As far as your next question, sorry, I forgot.
Sir, volume you consider?
Yeah, so the volume so the gross tumor volume will be the visible disease on the radiology scan, for example, CT, PET-CT or MRI. So that will be the gross disease. The one concept that I wanted to highlight for the audience is that if we give clinical target volume, that means the risk of microscopic disease, because we do not so we can't see the microscopic disease extension in a radiology scan. So we do give 5 mm of the clinical target volume, and because the lung is a moving organ, we cannot freeze the lung motion very routinely. Then we'll have to give a daily setup margin of 5 mm to the particular primary volume. So it will be whatever you see. So it will be approximately 1 centimeter more in each and every direction. So that will be the target volume as far as the primary is concerned. There is no role of the elective nodal irradiation. So elective nodal irradiation is not routinely advocated. The only station which is involved, for example, if there is a involvement of station 7, then station 7 will be taken, station 4 is so the station 4 will be taken. The only elective nodal irradiation, if you want to just add something, it will be the Hyler node. So it will be the Hyler node which will be involved. So because it will get inadvertently irradiated in all the lung cancer plannings. So as far as the nodal station is concerned, only elective nodal irradiation is not done. Only involved nodal station irradiation is done.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next question, Vijay sir. Sir, with concurrent, which are the chemo regimen we prefer?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So so when you go for concurrent, there are multiple regimens which have been recommended by NCCN. It's cisplatin, etoposide, paclitaxel, carboplatin, pemetrexed, cisplatin, cisplat, vinblastine. There are very few head-to-head comparisons, but there's a small phase 2 study which has compared paclitaxel, carboplatin weekly against 3 weekly cisplat, etoposide, and there's also subsequent meta-analysis also. And overall, it seems that the regimen which is has the most evidence in favor seems to be cisplat, etoposide, and the next evidence tilts in favor of weekly paclitaxel and carboplatin. The next regimen which would be applicable in adenocarcinoma would be pemetrexed and cisplatin. And we must remember that when you give concurrent chemoradiation, the toxicities of RT get amplified, and the completion rates also decrease to some extent. So patient needs to be fit when you consider patient for concurrent chemoradiation in lung. Anil, I wanted one favor from you. Our students somehow understand that pre-surgery there is exercise done. but there is limited understanding that when you do IMRT along with IGRT, how do you tell the patient about breathing pattern exercises, how on the table they should have a way they would breathe. Can you just talk about these things, which I don't think many of them know about this?
Yeah, sure, Vijay. So whenever we do radiation therapy, we know that the radiation therapy is not going to be delivered in one day. Okay, except the SRS, but we don't do SRS in lung planning routinely. So it will be done on a daily basis, and we know that the patient is, so this particular patient has a history of cough and a dry cough. So whenever you have a patient, the radiation therapy treatment, the actual treatment time is more or less 5 or 7 minutes in a particular day. And for 5 to 7 minutes, the patient, so breathing pattern should be as normal as possible. So that means the patient should breathe in a normal fashion. He or she should not cough, or there should not be any deep excursion of the breathing. So we ask generally the patient to breathe in a very normal way. And if the patient is having a significant amount of cough, so because this patient also sometimes do have a normal amount of lung effusion, or a collapsed lung, or a very large mass, or a bad lung. So these patients are very prone for cough and breathlessness. So if the patient is having a very bad cough, we ask them to take an antitussive just before the radiation therapy, so that as far as the treatment time is concerned, the patient is not having a significant amount of cough. If the patient still has got a good amount of motion in the lung, for example, lower lobe lung tumors are known to move with respiration close to the extent of 2 centimeters. So what we do as a part of radiation therapy, we assess the motion management. We assess the motion, how much is the motion. So currently at Tata Memorial Hospital, we do have a machine called 4-dimensional computed tomography. The short form is 4-dimensional CT. What it does is that it gives you the assessment of the tumor motion, how much the tumor is moving in the superior inferior direction, right and left direction, anterior and posterior direction. Majority of the time, the motion is larger in the superior inferior direction. So you will have to assess the tumor motion, and you will have to give the margins accordingly. So it will be a very individualized treatment planning. We do not give a blanket margin, just like we have to give 1 centimeter or 1.5 centimeter in the lower lobe, or 0.5 centimeter in the upper lobe. We do 4-dimensional CT scan for each and every patient of lung cancer radiation therapy, be it early stage non-small cell lung cancer, or be it locally advanced non-small cell lung cancer. The only advantage it gives us is that it reduces the treatment margin as far as the individual plan is concerned. So 4-dimensional CT scan is one of the motion management techniques that we do. The other one is the deep inspiratory breath hold. But unfortunately, lung cancer patients are not able to hold the breath for as long as possible that we want to them. And the third technique is the real-time respiratory tracking, which is very technologically advanced and challenging for lung cancer patients. So because it is not going to be a 1 centimeter or 2 centimeter lung mass, it is going to be a 5 centimeter or 6 centimeter when it comes for the singing CTRT. There are various other motion management techniques, but at the student level, what we should remember is that motion management is very essential whenever we are planning for lung cancer radiation therapy. And the most common technique is the 4-dimensional CT scan.
Okay, thank you, sir. Vijay, sir, in this chemo regimen, was cisplatin versus carboplatin? Any comments, sir? Which is better? Obviously, there is a
audible,
lot of
Ajay? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So in the chemo regimen, when you are going for a cisplat, the regimen development for cis versus carbo has not been very well analyzed in meta-analysis, neither in a randomized study. What has got taken up is the regimen. So cisplatin with etoposide and paclitaxel with carboplatin. So I was actually looking up in the morning if there's a data for paclitaxel with cisplatin. There's very limited data for paclitaxel with cisplatin. So the regimens which have got developed is like cis-eto, pemetrexed, cisplatin, paclitaxel with carboplatin. So when you're using a pacli-carbo regimen, even this has been used for cisplatin fit patient. But it goes without saying that if you're planning a cis-eto regimen or a pemetrexed cisplatin regimen, and if the patient is unfit for cisplatin, then only I would try to replace it with carboplatin in those kind of regimens. Saying that, I was actually looking in elderly patient, as I told you that giving concurrent chemotherapy along with the radiation, especially if you choose cisplatin etoposide, has its own share of toxicity. You get grade 3 and 4 toxicity in the range of 30 to 40% of very severe mucositis, basically esophagitis kind of pictures. Whether there is a simpler regimens are there. So I could get there's a randomized trial in elderly patients in which about 70 patients they had randomized to radiation versus radiation plus only single agent carboplatin, and addition of even single agent carboplatin led to a survival benefit. So to answer your question, there is no head-to-head comparison or meta-analysis which have compared in cisplatin fit patients whether the choice should be cisplatin or carboplatin. It goes logical with saying that if the patient is cisplatin fit, and if you're using a regimen which had an original component cisplatin, to use a cisplatin. If you're using something like paclitaxel carboplatin, this has been even used in cisplatin fit patients, so you can very well use a weekly pacli-carbo regimen. If patient is for some reason cisplatin unfit, then in these regimens like cis-eto or pemidatil cis, I would replace cisplatin with carboplatin. If patient is above 70 years of age and you have doubts about tolerance, then you can very well use something like a single agent carboplatin. Anil, I have one question here, and this is because the patient has rheumatoid arthritis. So this is an autoimmune disease. Do we anticipate any extra radiation side effects in these patients when you give radiation?
Not really, Vijay. There is no hard evidence to suggest that autoimmune disorders are prone for any additional radiation-like side effect. But yes, we do need to be watchful for the radiation side effect because the patient might have some conditions which are not diagnosed, so which are not easily diagnosed by the pulmonologist or the chest physician. For example, some component of interstitial lung disease might be there. So we need to be watchful for that, but I don't think so that we need to change our plan only on the basis of suspicion of interstitial lung disease. The only important factor that I wanted to highlight here is that if the patient do have a history or a documented evidence of interstitial lung disease, we need to counsel the patient. So we need to counsel the patient thoroughly because what happens in the interstitial lung disease, there are interstitial lung disease is a very huge term. There are 8 to 10 diagnoses which comes under the umbrella of interstitial lung disease. Hypersensitive interstitial pneumonitis, there are many other also. So it is not clear which patient will develop a higher incidence of radiation related side effect. So we need to be very careful and watchful, and we need to be very thorough whenever we are planning any radiation therapy in this particular group of patients. The one question that I have for you, Vijay, is that we know that so the paclitaxel will increase the chances of pneumonitis whenever given in combination with radiation therapy, and the etoposide will increase the chances of the esophagitis. So in the era of immunotherapy, because we know that the Pacific trial is very significant in improving the overall survival. So whenever we have a bad pulmonary function patient, so which is referred for CTRT, will you be changing your chemo regimen from paclitaxel to cisplatin plus etoposide? Because we know that there is no head-to-head comparison, and we do have a randomized control trial ongoing at TMH. So because if the patient will develop a CTRT, so post-CTRT radiation pneumonitis, the initiation of durvalumab might get delayed.
Yeah, so when the data came for durvalumab, I actually went back to what kind of chemotherapy regimens the specific trial had used. That data is there in the supplementary appendix and not in the full paper. So in fact, I read that paper again today morning because I anticipated someone might ask the same question. So cisplatin etoposide is used in 44% of those patients, and paclitaxel carboplatin is used in around 34% of the patients. A few patients also have got nab-pacli plus carbo kind of regimen. So looking at this data, it seems safe that when 33-35% of the patients have already gotten the trial paclitaxel carboplatin and then have received durvalumab, it doesn't seem like it increases the probability of you developing lung fibrosis. Saying that if patient already has a pre-existing lung fibrosis and you see that the lungs are bad and he is a candidate for durvalumab further, if the patient is completely fit, which means that patient is completely fit, PS is good, hematological parameters are good, renal functions are good, liver functions are good, and the only issue is like, especially in this case, like the patient had rheumatoid arthritis, and I would have seen some interstitial lung disease, I would tend to use cisplatin etoposide, because I think that maintenance with durvalumab is as important as cisplatin RT, chemo RT. That part also adds to lifespan. So I would have made that changes. But saying that cisplatin etoposide does cause a lot of side effects.
Yes.
And so you need to be careful while you are using cisplatin. In fact, I would like Dr. Vanitha to comment on that. Madam, cisplatin etoposide versus paclitaxel carboplatin as concurrent.
One second. Sorry, Vijay, I heard my name. What did you say?
Ma'am, cisplatin etoposide versus paclitaxel carboplatin as concurrent.
So, that we have had this discussion so many times. Yeah? So we don't have any.
Yeah, it's for the sake of the students, ma'am.
Yeah. Sorry. The I think the bulk of the data is for cis etoposide. It looks like, at least numerically, the cis etoposide concurrently with RT appears to be somewhat better, but we have absolutely no data. Hence, we are running the study. And I think you were discussing about the toxicity. So definitely the toxicity that different taxanes will cause a little bit more pneumonitis, and the other will cause a little bit more of myelosuppression. So I think patient-related issues are most important to individualize and choose.
Kumar sir is there.
I think utna hi yaar.
Yeah. Madam, I have actually a question for Dr. Kumar sir. Patient has rheumatoid arthritis and is on sulfasalazine. Let's say that the patient is a candidate for, he's a candidate for durvalumab. So what precautions one should take when giving durvalumab to a patient who already has a known autoimmune disease?
So autoimmune disease flares up, that which is known for immunotherapy, and that makes a challenge in delivering it. Second is that already you have an immunosuppressive agent or steroid is a part of a treatment, and that creates a challenge in delivering it. But having said that, I know, and yes, there is a chance to increase the autoimmune phenomenon in these patients. But with time, we have realized that yes, it is a challenge. But in selected patients, one can try and give it. And it appears that if you are careful, that then in a fair number of patients, you will be able to deliver it. As Ajay will, if he's the same patient, then Ajay will, I think so, take through the journey with what happened with this patient. And that was interesting. The kind of chances we took and the kind of discussions it happened. So what I'm trying to convey, yes, one has to be very careful. There's no doubt about it, because you can land up in a situation which can be potential fatal also, depending upon which autoimmune disease we are talking about. But let us not, in today's time, for immunotherapy, we have a blanket thought process that with an autoimmune disease, we shouldn't be giving immunotherapy. That shouldn't be the case.
Yes, sir. This patient has a flare up of the rheumatoid arthritis, grade 3.
You can bring out in your comfort time when you want to bring out that issue. I will just highlight it because I know that you are also. I am aware of the details, so that's the reason I thought I just let it known. But you can bring out when and as and when you want.
We should be very careful. So right now already we are discussing on the consolidation part. So I'll just ask Vijay sir to discuss in short regarding consolidation. As conventionally there were evidence to give 2 more cycles of chemotherapy, and now we have Pacific data. So I just wanted a view of the Vijay sir. What is his view on at current era regarding consolidation?
Current era, I think if the patient is affording, there is no doubt that the patient should go for durvalumab maintenance. So if the patient is post CTIT has not progressed, he is fit, he should go for durvalumab. So the question for giving consolidation chemotherapy was there, and there was no there was evidence was both ways, should you give or should not give. But if you look at the way the evidence came, it was like if you had given a weekly Paclitaxel carbo kind of regimen, so these weekly regimens, then there was a thought process that giving this 2 cycles of consolidation chemotherapy would be beneficial. But if you are given us this ETO kind of a 3 weekly kind of regimen, there was not much to add with giving those 2 cycles of consolidation chemotherapy. That is my understanding of the literature with this. But today, I think the benefit of durvalumab is there. So it should be given to all those patients who can afford it, because it has a survival benefit, and it's a pretty good survival benefit which you get with durvalumab.
Yes, sir. If feasible, definitely we should go ahead with the durvalumab. And in that case, actually, if you are planning to start immunotherapy, we should avoid also to giving 2 cycles of consolidation chemo to decrease the risk of pneumonitis. And if it is not feasible, then obviously we should give at least 2 cycles of consolidation chemotherapy if patient is fit to receive those 2 cycles of chemotherapy post CTRT. So next, actually, because of shortage of time, sir, I just wanted to Anil sir to comment regarding how to follow up these patients post CTRT when they are on immunotherapy.
So I think so the follow-up remains so more or less the same. I'm not very much aware about the follow-up details about the Pacific study, but I think so when the patient is having a CTRT and post CTRT, the first follow-up should be done at a minimum time of 8 to 12 weeks. So preferably with the help of PET CT scan, because it will give us an indication whether the patient has progressed or not. We do the PET CT as a marker of prognostic importance also. And then every 3 months with a CCT thorax abdomen for the first 2 years, and then every 6 monthly. The reason that I want to do a CCT thorax and abdomen for the next 2 years post CTRT is that so as you are aware, the median progression-free survival post CTRT is not more than 24 to 28 to 30 months. So majority of the time, this patient will be progressing within a span of 2 years. Approximately 50% will progress, and the chances of developing pneumonitis will also peak at the rate of at approximately 3 to 6 months post CTRT. So if the patient is developing pneumonitis, we need to be very watchful for that, and the treatment so needs to be started as early as possible, because the radiation pneumonitis might affect the quality of life in a very dramatic and a very in a very dangerous way for the patient.
Yes, sir. Virendra sir and Vijay sir, would you like to add anything else?
When the patient is on durvalumab, you should be also looking at the TSH and the all other immunotherapy related side effects workups also, so that you don't miss on patient developing any autoimmune toxicities, especially in this patient.
Okay, sir. So I'll just come to the last question. So to Rajiv sir, as you are aware about the case, this patient on follow-up PET CT at 3 months had this residual uptake and lymph node uptake. Along with that, there was a new onset of patch in the opposite lung. So based on imaging, it was labeled as infective changes, but we are still doubtful. So we did the HPR. We did the biopsy of this new lung lesion. Any comment on those?
Yeah, so the biopsy from the opposite side lung lesion, it had is negative for malignancy. That was the one of the important because if it turned out to be malignancy, then the whole staging will begin. And but it is interesting the granulomat inflammation, and although we did the special stains to rule out the fungal or tuberous, so on the biopsy, but that possibility cannot be completely ruled out. The possibility of the other granulomatous lesions, the tuberculosis. So you must have sent us the samples were sent for gene expert, I think, and I believe that is also negative. So in addition to the infective causes and this patient being on this rheumatoid arthritis, so there are in some patients we can get a necrotizing granulomatous response related to the rheumatoid nodules, so which may mimic. So that thing also we have to keep in mind. That is granulomatous response may be purely related to her will exclude the rest of the infection. Tuberculosis is high on the list, and rare possibility of vaginals also should be considered, especially in this case, because there are some areas which shows basophilic like necrosis, which we sometimes see in the GPA. But for that you need
question put on the chat box by Akhil. Let's take a scenario where patient was on adjuvant durvalumab and patient progressed at 8 months.
not discrimination.
Hello.
Hello.
Let's take. There's a question put by Akhil in the chat box that let's take a scenario where patient was on adjuvant durvalumab, patient progressed at 8 months, EGFR exon 19 positive in NGS. What should you be used at this time? Dr. Vanita, any thoughts?
So probably chemotherapy initially, chance of the patient developing severe toxicity because the patient was right on immunotherapy would be quite high. So what we usually say is at least you should have 3-month window period between stopping immunotherapy and starting an oral TKI. I think that's the point you were trying to make, Akhil, about starting oral TKI.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So chemotherapy, and the question is, what do we do with these patients in terms of adding immunotherapy? I guess. So initially, obviously, we will be giving chemotherapy and then changing to oral TKI after an appropriate window period. And we don't actually know what that appropriate window period is. It is minimum of 3 months, but we have seen excessive toxicity up to even a year later. So minimum of 3 months, but as long as possible. So maybe you can give 4 cycles of PEM carbo and then change over to oral TKI. But I don't think we have hard data for that either, right? I don't know, what are other people's thoughts? Akhil, your thoughts?
Yes, ma'am. I think only chemotherapy will be an option in this patient because the patient was already on a immunotherapy drug and has progressed now. So I think only chemotherapy as a bridge for next 2 to 3 months, and then switching over to osimertinib like drug. And also, LAURA trial results are expected in December 2022. So we'll know whether to use osimertinib post CTRT as adjuvant treatment in EGFR mutant patients. So that will give us more clear answer and will help us to come out of this situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. I think, and the problem with excessive toxicity is when you're using osimertinib and the higher order oral TKIs, it is less so if you're using gefitinib and erlotinib, but not zero. So still to be kept in mind.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And if patient is by any chance not fit for chemotherapy due to performance status or any other problem, I think gefitinib can be considered if there is no other option. Correct, ma'am?
Question by Kishore, need of doing PDL1 and EGFR before durvalumab. Vijay sir.
PDL1, and I actually would do in all locally advanced patients molecular markers. That's because that's an information I would always like to have it in my hand, because sometimes the patient might progress and you might not get adequate time, and even when you give durvalumab, most of those patients in subsequent few years would progress. So if I get a report that the patient is EGFR mutation positive, and I would look at the PDL1 expression. So if you look at the subgroup analysis for specific study, the benefit of durvalumab decreases as the PDL1 scores decrease, and the PDL1 scores below 1% have very limited benefit. And if I know that the patient is EGFR mutation positive or ALK mutation positive, I would actually post CTRT. If I know that this patient is EGFR or ALK mutation positive, this is again my personal opinion, I may just observe the patients and wait for the patient to progress so that I can bring in the TKI. Because I agree with what Dr. Vanitha ma'am said and Akhil said, that if you use immunotherapy in this, so the situation what I'm talking about is patient is EGFR ALK positive, and there's a good chance that when the patient is EGFR and ALK positive, the PDL1 score would be 0%. And so this is the situation I'm talking about. And I know that there will be a limited benefit with durvalumab. In that one, I would tend to have a discussion with the patient, explain him these things, and I would tend to keep the patient on observation with regular scans. And whenever the patient progresses, to introduce the TKI at that point of time and not give durvalumab, because it may hamper my ability to give TKI at a later stage. Kumar sir, Vanitha ma'am, what would you do in this situation? Patient comes EGFR mutation positive or ALK mutation positive, and the PDL1 score is low, let's say 0.
So Vijay, there was an interesting. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So there was an interesting commentary on that when it was discussed by someone recently, that you have a phase 3 evidence, but you have a different practice, and this is important for all of us to learn and remember. There was no such subgroup analysis which was required as per trial was there, but this is also true that we can't be blind to the data what we see and the repercussions. And that is what has led to what you said, that we should be very careful about using durvalumab in these patients when you have mutation being positive, because of both the things, efficacy being in subgroup being an issue, and second, the implications on the further treatment. So what you suggested and concluded was right, and but majority people believe this, but I do get a small number of people who insist upon that they will use it. But yes, by and large, people agree. Definitely, this is one group. Sure, majority people agree that only PDL1 should not be the criteria. That is another question. But if it is mutation positive, whatever may be PDL1 expression, there is a by and large, a strong merit that one shouldn't be using it.
Sir, if for a hypothetical situation, we take a situation that the PDL1 is, let's say, 90%, and the patient is EGFR mutation positive, then would you be then in my mind, I would be tend to give durvalumab for the benefit which is there? Like,
I agree with you. If you have asked me this question around a year or 2 years back, I would have said the similar thing. But with time, what we have realized, and here I think again Dr. Rajiv can comment a bit more, what we have observed that these mutations positive patients do have higher, usually they do have higher PDL1 expression. But more and more data coming in that this expression has a very limited value as far as the efficacy is concerned. And that data comes primarily from the stage 4 disease. So again, I'm think about using, that's why I say phase 3 trials are important, but we do get into the data when data is very striking. So that these again data are very striking, that somehow in this mutation positive patients, the efficacy of immunotherapy is very limited. I'm using word limited, I'm not saying none, because everyone then comes up with that there was that 1%, one patient or 1% or one-off patient who responded, and I do agree it happens, but it is so limited that people usually don't give it. In fact, now there's a fair agreement that except KRAS, one has to be very careful in advanced stage, that is stage 4 or palliative setting, non-small cell lung cancer, for giving immunotherapy. And that is what I'm extrapolating here. So I take your point, what you're saying, Vijay.
but maybe some time back, I would have been comfortable. Here, the question is, think about, you have a disease, progressive disease with massive pleural effusion and a brain mets and EGFR mutation positive. We will curse ourselves if the patient would have been able to take osimertinib, no financial issues, and we are waiting for 3 months.
Yeah, no, I agree. I have one more, just because I think we have already passed time, but one more query here, sir. So whenever we look at drug development, this data that the PD-L1 expression doesn't has impact on EGFR mainly comes from pembrolizumab, and I believe that data that immunotherapy exposure after that giving TK also basically comes from pembrolizumab. Do you think it is okay that using the data of pembrolizumab, we generalize it for nivolumab, durvalumab, atezolizumab? It may so happen that the other drugs, because we don't have the data, we actually don't know, the other drugs may not have any impact on the safety pattern. Your comments, sir?
Safety part, I agree with you. I know I'll come to the safety part. After another comment of once I make it, that efficacy part is for many of them. So many of them, immunotherapy has been used in the patients with mutation positive patient, and then looks like alone giving immunotherapy, you have once in a while patient responding. By and large they don't, and that's why Empower 150 subgroup analysis became a lot of talking point, because there was a survival and a benefit in the subgroup analysis, but with those 4 drugs, but in practice we have not been able to extrapolate that result. Coming to the safety part. Safety part is that it's not like trials have stopped, Vijay. Now also trials are going on in combining and sequencing and trying to see how one can use immunotherapy, because this is if it works, this drug works very well, and it's not like TKIs are curing our patients. They are also not curing our patients. So people are now also on that they want to use this combination and sequencing to see that how they can do it. So people have not abandoned it. But in routine care, this is one of the important aspects. Something efficacy is doubtful, and the concept wise, side effects are there, then you do tend to not use that treatment for some time, unless you do have evidence to contrary. If you wanted to bring out the discussion about does the toxicity for PD-L1, PD-1 and these different drugs are different, or CTLA-4, sure, CTLA-4 and PD-L1 is definitely different. For PD-L1, PD-1, there is some evidences that it may be different. So there's a possibility. But again, because the concept wise, they're all checkpoint inhibitor. Once you have few patients dying, because Virinder is there, I can take analogy from surgery. So he doesn't want to take the patient on the table for 5% mortality for pneumonectomy, but for 1% he takes it. So meaning that the moment few patients starts dying on the treatment, you start becoming very defensive in taking those patients on that treatment.
Yes, sir, agree.
Yeah. Sir, one more question. I just got one more doubt. So EGFR mutated patient, we give osimertinib, patient progresses, you give pemetrexed carboplatin. So would you prefer giving them immunotherapy after this, like post osimertinib, post let's say he has this with lazertinib, amivantamab, he has exhausted all options with TKI, he has exhausted options with chemotherapy, then would you place immunotherapy in that in this driver mutation positive patients?
Yes, no, I have given, and I agree with you. But maybe after docetaxel, and maybe if I have a gemcitabine after, then maybe after gemcitabine, or combining with them, because there is some data, not exclusively for the mutation positive patient, but it was in all comer. that combining the chemotherapy plus immunotherapy in second line. This was a small study. Somehow the single agent became such a big study and then subsequently moved to the first line. So this data didn't pick up. This is a JAMA oncology paper that combining it was better when it was combined, but this was compared with chemotherapy. But if you see the data, it looks a bit better than only immunotherapy. So I'll say yes, that will be again something I'll be okay doing it. So I had never said that I'll never be using it, because one of patients in the trial also they respond, and second, PD-L1 is a problematic biomarker for expression, because not necessarily if you're seeing in the slide it is expression is less where you have got the tumor from, what has happened, and is it that the best biomarker we are using. So there will be one of patient response, and if the resources are not constrained, I will be using it somewhere in the line, but as late as possible.
Sorry, I'm extending this discussion, but this is interesting.
Go ahead.
What would be your
Sorry,
stand
Vijay,
if, say, yes, ma'am?
I just want to tell, may I
Yeah.
interject for a second? So I think your point is very well taken about adding immunotherapy in relapse setting. I just wanted to emphasize that in these patients with more and more understanding of the molecular pathways of resistance, it has become increasingly important to keep repeating the biopsy at progression. Because we have so many mechanisms now met and our fusions and multiple things that we could intervene other than just than giving blindly chemotherapy. So just wanted to emphasize that at least in the patients who have molecularly driven tumors, it's very important to biopsy at progression.
Sir, one more doubt which I have is, let's take the scenario when the patient is of EGFR mutated and he's progressed to osimertinib, you did biopsies. Now the patient comes with microsatellite instability. Now, would you still put pembro after gemcitabine and docetaxel, or you'll pull it earlier?
So okay, so this becomes interesting, Vijay. So the responses to now this is where we as a clinician become differently. In fact, I'll add one more situation to it just to clarify my point. How we respond to the data what we have. MSI. This is something now. This data MSI and being positive, and then EGFR mutation. This I often don't remember, but the responses for MSI positive and PD-L1 positive is far different. So if you have PD-L1 positive patients of 5%, 2%, 10%, the responses are in the tune of going very lower double digits. It doesn't reach around 20% by and large. But if you have MSI positive, we do know it reaches upper part of the double digit. It goes 60%, 70%, depending upon which trial we're looking for. So I totally agree what you wanted to bring out, that the biomarker and the responses decides. Let me add one more to it. TMB. Now, TMB has a similar kind of approval as you have for MSI. That is tumor agnostic, and if you have high 10 mutations per megabase and by FDA. But again, if a TMB is high, then I won't have a similar response, because TMB high, again, it was tumor agnostic. Responses were higher, not as high as what we have seen with the MSI. And more important, we have started looking, as far as the TMB is concerned, lot more data coming in that it does have got, it is not as tumor agnostic as we thought. There was a negative study for lung cancer subsequently. But before negative study also, the kind of responses what you see with TMB high, you are not as tempted as what you are for MSI.
I have got one more doubt when I was just we were talking. So concern that that when we gave it for this, does this concern with immunotherapy PD-L1 expression not is only for EGFR mutation, or this concern you would have also for ALK, BRAF, NTRK?
So in general, definitely it is for EGFR, definitely it is for ALK, definitely it is for ROS. Now data is there for BRAF, which was separately analyzed for PD-L1 expression, and the responses. And then recently I saw the data for CMET. Initially, CMET was clubbed into that they may respond to immunotherapy, but just recently the data has come. Looks like CMET also belongs to that same group. So it looks like, except for KRAS, today we need to be very careful about as far as the efficacy is concerned. If we want to use immunotherapy for mutation positive lung cancer patient. And that brings the challenge for the KRAS patient, but hopefully by the time more data will be there when the drug is in the market in India.
I think I have already overshooted the time for today's class, so I thank all. Anyone, any student has any questions, you can ask. If no questions, I think we'll close this class.